Hi everyone, I'm Glenn Diesen, and today I'm joined by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Trump, combat veteran, PhD, and author of many books on military strategy, as well as the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Good to see you again, Colonel.
Good to see you, Glenn.
So over the past week, we see that Russians have been plowing through Ukraine's collapsing defensive lines, and there's now, I guess, very open panic in NATO as we seem to be losing this war. And the response has been escalation or reckless escalation, one might say, as the US is now sending these long-range ATACMS, which Blinken suggests the Ukrainians can use as they please. We'll see the British now openly encouraging the Ukrainians to use British missiles to strike inside Russian territory. And the French are even sending troops, at least, well, yes, they have already sent troops. So it seems to me that, well, the line between a proxy war and direct war is becoming increasingly thin if it hasn't been crossed already. And we see that the Russians responded now by calling in the French and the British ambassador to the foreign ministry, but also announcing this tactical nuclear missiles exercise. And of course, one can blow this off as the Russians merely communicating its deterrent, but it also seems, I guess, that this is something very different. So I guess the whole idea that NATO countries can attack Russia without retaliation no longer works. And I think the fear in Moscow is that its restraints is interpreted as weakness. And anyways, my impression now is that from Moscow that this is not a bluff, that we're getting very close to a Russian military retaliation against NATO countries. But again, this is why I really wanted to speak with you as well. As my question is, how do you read all of this development, and how could Russia actually retaliate if this continues to escalate? Do you see it's a possibility of merely striking Western targets in Ukraine or striking targets outside of Ukraine? Is any possibility of striking logistic systems in Poland and Romania? How do you see this situation moving forward?
The Ukrainian army is actually in worse condition today than, let us say, the British Expeditionary Force in 1940 on the beaches of Dunkirk. And some of your viewers will understand what I'm talking about. The war is lost. It's not a question of it's losing. It's been lost for a long time. The Russians have chosen to exercise restraint in the hope that wiser heads would prevail in the West and there would be some sort of discussion leading to a ceasefire and then eventually a settlement that would be signed on by at least the states in Eastern Europe. In other words, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and perhaps Washington. That has not materialized. And so the Russians have now finally said, after a long and muddy and cold winter, seeing the Ukrainians in complete disarray, they are now moving west. Now, we know that they are very definitely going to roll up the territory from where they are now to the Dnieper River. I don't think they have much choice because we made it very clear we will not negotiate, we will not discuss anything, we will not talk with them. That means that they've got to make provisions to accomplish all of their original goals, which was to consolidate control of the territory, which is historically Russian. That means from Kharkov to Odessa. But now they have to consider the very high probability that they'll have to go into Kiev and root out whatever is left of the criminal regime in Kiev that has been our puppet throughout this operation. Now, having said all of that, there's something else at play now, and that is that imagine if the British had taken whatever forces it had left and thrown all of them into the fight while their army was standing on the beaches at Dunkirk. Well, it wouldn't have changed anything. The Germans would have simply rolled up and killed everybody or taken them prisoner. Wouldn't have worked. Well, we're in the same position right now with regard to the Ukrainians. We're now throwing in everything in a last-ditch effort based more on hope than reality that somehow or another it's going to make a difference. And the difference it's going to make is as follows. if these long-range strike weapons, remember we've talked about the Taurus, we've talked about the Shadow Strike, there are all sorts of different weapon systems out there belonging to the British, the French, and the Germans. If those are actually used against Russian targets on Russian territory, and they kill Russian citizens, whether or not they're in uniform, Russia has stated very clearly they reserve the right to treat France, Germany, Britain, anybody else who contributes to this as a co-belligerent. Now, you asked the question, what can the Russians do? Well, I think you have to understand that the Iskander missile and other systems like it have the capability of striking targets from, I would say, Spitsbergen up near the Arctic Circle, all the way to southern Portugal. So they have a rich target set from which to choose. They have no shortage of missiles. Now, their preference would be not to do that. But the British have made it very clear that they are resisting reality. Sometimes I think the British and the French are both lost in a world that doesn't exist. They fancy that this is 1854 and they're dealing with a crisis in the Crimea and that Russia is backward and incapable of really responding, which was almost true in 1854. And the Russians ultimately abandoned their efforts to move further west and gave up on the war in Crimea, largely because they had no means of supplying Crimea and their forces that were there. Well, that's not true anymore. Russia is a modern scientific industrial power with an abundance of resources and endless production capability when it comes to military equipment. It now has the largest and arguably the best battle-hardened army anywhere in the world. And to this must be added their rocket forces, their strategic forces, their aircraft, manned and unmanned. All of these are in a very high state of readiness. And final point is this. The Russians have always said that they would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. But the Russians are watching us, and they have slowly but surely begun to convince themselves that we're serious about invading Ukraine. They see forces gathering in places like Poland and Lithuania, as well as down in Romania and in Moldova. And they say, these people are crazy. What do we do? How do we warn them off? How do we persuade them that we are indeed serious? One of those ways is to make it abundantly clear that the warheads can go very quickly from conventional warheads to nuclear warheads. We say a tactical nuclear weapon, we usually are referring to something that's 5 kilotons or less. And Russia has made it clear this is our territory. In other words, the territory in East Ukraine they control right now is part of Russia. And oh, by the way, we will not tolerate anything lines. And so you get these very straightforward statements by Foreign Minister Lavrov, as well as by Medvedev and others, making it abundantly clear you are now on very dangerous ground. If this continues, we will probably begin with NATO bases, that is British and French concentrations on the continent, but we will not stop there. We will actually consider striking positions in the British Isles as well as in metropolitan France. So you had better figure this out and get out of the way, or we're going to attack. Now, you know, the French have already lost 7 soldiers. They announced that. President Xi visited recently with Macron. After the meeting, Macron began to walk back some of his more ridiculous statements about what France was ready to do in Ukraine. I think the truth is seeping in, but there are 2 places where the truth is not fully grasped right now that are dangerously out of touch with reality. One is London, and the other is Washington. And the statesmen, or the politicians, rather, that control matters in both of those places are not taking the Russians as seriously as they should. Because, it's one thing for us to abandon our so-called red lines. Practically every red line that Biden ever mentioned, ATACMS missiles, F-16 aircraft, any number of things, have all been abandoned. The Russians have not abandoned their red lines, and they've just given you a very good picture of what they consider the red lines to be. U.S., British, French, or other NATO combat forces and long-range weapon systems on the soil of Ukraine. That's it. Get them out and get out soon, because if this continues, you will end up at war with us. And the Russians are prepared to fight. We are not.
Yeah, I saw that Macron was walking back some of his statements. He was making the argument that France is not at war with Russia. But again, uh, this is a nice narrative to tell oneself here in NATO. But obviously, if the tables were turned, imagine, yeah, the Russians were in Mexico and they were supplying the weapons and you know, green lighting, targeting American cities. Obviously, the sentiment would be very different. So I guess my question though is to what extent is NATO already at war with Russia, besides supplying the weapons, the training and intelligence, war planning? Because well, a while back there was this leaked discussion between some German officers, I think, including a general, that there's many, in his words, many Americans in civilian clothing that might assist with operating these complex weapon systems and missiles, which the Ukrainians aren't trained for. And so I guess my question is to what extent are NATO military personnel actually pulling the trigger, effectively now being fully involved in this war against Russia?
Well, they are involved, and they have been for well over a year. In fact, I would argue almost from the beginning, although the long range strike weapons that we're talking about, that's a matter for control by the British, French, Germans, Americans, and others, no doubt. So that's clear. The Russians are aware of this. The Russians have refrained until quite recently from systematically targeting NATO troops on the ground. In other words, soldiers or advisors that are there to help the Ukrainians maintain and employ these weapon systems. And remember, we have cells on the ground in that country, as well as in Poland and Germany and elsewhere, that are providing the intelligence, the reconnaissance, and the surveillance capabilities from our space-based assets and high-altitude assets to the Ukrainians. That's why the Russians have been very careful about massing forces. That's why they've moved very deliberately, because they know that we can see most of what they do with great clarity, just as they can see most of what we do with great clarity. They've adjusted and adapted. The Ukrainians have not. The Ukrainians have behaved as though that none of that existed, and that's why you now have 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers at least, and 1 million plus casualties. So I think the Russians know those things, and I think the Russians are telling us what they know. And the ball is now in our court. Either we cease and desist and back away, or we risk a direct confrontation with Russia. And that confrontation will have harsh consequences for us: economic consequences, disruptions in supply chains, destruction of whatever energy infrastructure still exists. There are a whole range of things that could happen. This is not something that Moscow wants, but Moscow is signaling we can do this. Now, the response to this, and the only response that we have, since we are so weak conventionally, is a nuclear one. And again, the Russians have said, if you use a nuclear weapon, we will respond. He said, we will all die. These are words from Putin. We will all die, but at least we will go to heaven as martyrs. Now, that's a hell of a note, but he's made that very clear. So we would be very stupid to breach the nuclear threshold and question the resolve of the Russians to act. But again, you're dealing with people who have been out of touch with reality virtually from the moment this began. And they have been lying prolifically to their populations, to their electorates. So how many people in Europe actually know the truth? They think that Putin woke up one morning and said, oh gosh, I think I'll invade Ukraine, which is, of course, absurd. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was goaded and provoked into this, as the Russian people were. The notion that every Russian wakes up every morning and sharpens his bayonet and can't wait to go to war against us is equally stupid. This thing needs to end, and it can end. And the sooner it ends, the better for everyone concerned. But right now, we still have a lot of people who have made outrageous statements, Glenn, and they can't retreat from stupid positions. We went through this in Vietnam with Lyndon Johnson. And then subsequently, Nixon, I think, foolishly listened to Kissinger, who kept saying, oh, we can't just withdraw. The Soviets will think we're weak. Well, we know now in retrospect, the Soviets thought we were stupid for being there to begin with. And they were right, just as they were stupid to waste their time in Afghanistan. And we were right. But we are stupid staying in Ukraine and pressing this issue, because that's a guarantee that not only will the rest of Ukraine be destroyed, but that we end up at war with a power that's not really our enemy. Now, how do you get this across in the current environment, particularly when the media is obediently repeating stupidity every day and every night, lie after lie about what's really happening on the ground in Ukraine? It reminds me of in this movie with Bruno Ganz, who has now passed away, Untergang, where this secretary says, "But mein Führer, what about the inevitable victory?" And of course, he turns, walks into his room, and shuts the door. Well, I think we're going to have a similar response very shortly on the Western side. So we need to stop. We need to get out, and we need to signal very clearly we are going to suspend all further military aid. We should continue to provide humanitarian assistance because that's what Ukraine really needs. But otherwise, we need to get out of this war. We need to end it. And then we need to sit down and get the best outcome that we can from the Russians, who are clearly in the victorious position. After all, it's their part of the world. Everyone forgets the Russians controlled most of it for the last 300 or 400 years. The only ones who competed were the Lithuanians and Poles. No one in Western Europe, no one in the United States ever had any designs on any of these places. So the notion that somehow or another this makes or breaks us as great powers is absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting what you say about that Russia was goaded into this, because this is, I think, one of the most terrifying things in the media, the complete absence of context. And at least in the United States, I feel there's more more context. As well, the whole idea that well, the continued escalation of NATO, it seems to be based on the explicit premise that Russia could merely pull out of Ukraine and the war would be over. But again, all this is based on the idea that Russia merely decided one day it wanted new territories. But this neglects that the war really began in 2014. And there's actually an interesting article 2 months ago in the New York Times, because after the NATO-backed coup in 2014 to overturn Ukraine's neutrality, the first thing the intelligence chief of the new Ukrainian government, by the way, that Nuland and Washington had handpicked, was to form a partnership with CIA and MI6 in a covert war against Russia. Again, this is reported in the New York Times, and it started on day one, well before Russia even reacted by taking Crimea. So it just seems that at no point over the past 2 years since Russia invaded has NATO countries engaged in diplomacy. They ruled out any end to NATO expansion, and they even made clear that once the war is over, Ukraine will join NATO. And again, this is a war considered to be an existential threat by Russia. Even if we don't agree, this is obviously what they're acting upon. So I think as NATO shuts the door to diplomacy, the only acceptable outcome for the Russians is victory. And as you also stated, this is why I find it such a strange policy, because with this huge escalation, with this long-range missile sending in troops, it's either the West would be successful and Russia would retaliate with nuclear weapons, or we're unsuccessful, which seems much more likely, but we nonetheless risk retaliation and, of course, not just destruction of Ukraine, but collapse of NATO, possible nuclear war. I just don't understand what is seemingly the plan in Washington. Is it merely gradually bleeding the
well,
Russians, or?
Well, there are two things, I think. First, to go back to David Cameron in particular, because I found his remarks most interesting and dangerous, frankly. He was asked, well, what can the Russians do? And he said, well, they can bring this conflict to an immediate end by simply withdrawing their forces, which I thought was a statement rooted in a combination of ignorance and arrogance that defies reason. That would be like saying, well, the quickest way to end Britain's war in Ireland in 1920 is to withdraw. Well, that's what they did eventually. They did withdraw. But this is not Ireland, and this is Russia, not Britain. And unlike Ireland, which is separated from the British Isles and from Great Britain, this adjoins Russia. And about half of the people that live in the place are effectively, culturally, linguistically, and otherwise Russians. So the notion that somehow or another everything can be solved by removing the Russians is absurd. There's something else involved here, and I think it's important. I think the ruling class in Europe and in the United States is losing its grip on power. I really do. I think this globalist neocon class that has opened your borders, admitted tens of millions of people that no one asked for, who cannot be assimilated, who don't want to assimilate, who want to essentially settle and conquer you and us, to be blunt, is part of the problem. The electorate, at least in the United States, and I think increasingly in continental Europe, is awakened to this danger. And I think they're disgusted with it. We are within inches of a catastrophic financial crisis, an economic downturn. Now, there are lots of people that will show up every day and tell you everything's just fine. I'm always reminded of the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. His name was Mellon. And in June of 1929, he gave a famous speech, which was designed to calm the fears that were prevalent that we were nearing a serious crisis in the economy and the financial markets. And he said, Americans live in an era of unbroken prosperity. Well, that was June. October, everything collapsed. I think you're in a similar situation right now. The debt consumption or the consumption through debt financing is about over. Fiat currencies are almost played out. The intelligent thing would be to cut back dramatically on spending, which no politician in power wants to do, because that means a total loss of power on their part. And then to retrench, to recognize that you cannot afford to do everything everywhere all the time, to stop pretending that your resources are limitless. And we have a population that knows that those resources are limited, and the population is angry because they see their prosperity falling. If you go to Germany, it still looks good from a distance, but people see that things are missing on the shelves. They see the prices of things rising. There's a palpable sense of fear as an undercurrent. I think that's true in much of Europe. I think Europeans understand things are going to get much worse before they get better. So under those circumstances, what does the ruling class do? It ignores reality. It pretends everything is fine, and it launches escapades overseas on the assumption that this will divert attention and distract people. Well, this is no distraction with Russia. A war with Russia will not divert attention. It will destroy Europe. And we need to understand in the United States that this will touch us as well. We will not escape unscathed. And we have nothing really to throw into the fight. We can't even recruit for our armed forces. The Russians look at our armed forces populated with women and, men of, I would argue, less than high caliber in terms of discipline, training, and leadership, and they laugh, and they're right to laugh. They know that we don't amount to a tinker's dam on the battlefield right now. Americans are delusional. Europeans are delusional about this. They need to wake up, but they're not going to wake up until something bad happens. I just hope that the bad thing that happens that interrupts all of this is financial rather than military. But if we continue to press, I think the Russians are quite serious. I think they will use whatever weapons they have at their disposal. And if that doesn't work, they will detonate a tactical nuclear weapon on Ukrainian soil against a concentration of Ukrainian and NATO forces to make the point. We've had it. No more. Press further and you will reap the whirlwind.
It's just amazing we actually got to this point. And it's also surprised me there's not a wider debate about the strategic, grand strategy here, because in the 90s, I think, at least for the Europeans, it made sense just to align with the Americans. They will, well, at the end of the day, they will always win, and all power is concentrated. But 30 years down the road, with this huge debt, there's a strange mix now between high interest rates and a faltering economy, and it's not looking much better in Europe. In fact, I would suggest it's somewhat worse. With this economic problem is social problem, which leads to political problems. And meanwhile, all the main rising powers don't want to live in this hegemonic world anymore. So they're all beginning to diversify their economic connectivity and integrating, as in BRICS. And And none of this appears to impact the strategic thinking that a new world is actually emerging, and we might have to readjust to reality. But I'm wondering, is there some change in the strategic thinking though? Because we don't usually admit defeat, but at least you see politicians and the media stop talking about the wars which we lose interest in. I mean, here in Europe, Ukraine is still on top of the headlines, but is the United States growing sick of Ukraine? Is there a more attractive war on the horizon? How?
Well, I think in the United States, the focus is increasingly on Israel. And you have a situation in Israel, which is, I would argue, very desperate. The Israelis are in a very difficult position. They cannot declare victory and end the war because they haven't had any victory. They are caught up in this radical frenzy of murder and expulsion of people from Gaza. They're into it to the point where I think Mr. Netanyahu thinks along the following lines. First of all, I have control of America. I control the United States. As long as I have control of the United States and the United States is compelled to support me regardless of what I do, I've got to continue. There's no way out of this. Either I utterly defeat all my potential opponents and adversaries in the region and establish my unchallenged strategic dominance, or I risk total failure and potentially collapse. Now, I know a lot of people look at him and think that he's focused on himself and the charges that he faces. I think people are selling him short. At some point, you have to believe what people say. Take them at their word. I think Mr. Netanyahu is a serious, what we would call Jewish supremacist. And he is bound and determined to establish that once and for all, because he thinks that's what he owes the Jewish people in the region. Now, you and I can debate the wisdom of that, but that's what he believes, and he's surrounded by a lot of people who agree with him. And I think most of the population still backs this policy, even though they may dislike him personally, they still back it. Now, that's a dangerous position to take because at some point, the adversaries that you are dealing with, that you regard as weak and incapable, turn out to be capable, and they are no longer weak. There is nothing to stop him in Gaza. Let's be frank. There's nothing there. Jordan is a very weak state. Its king, who is normally a very sharp, balanced individual, made a terrible mistake when he cast his lot with us, the British, and Israel against Iran. Not against Iran per se, but to help defend Israel. Just the other day, I think it was yesterday, maybe 24, 36 hours ago, Mohammed bin Salman, the king or the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, survived an assassination attempt. I think that's just the beginning because the Muslim Arab populations in the region are sick to death of the people that rule them, not necessarily because they're corrupt or oppressive, but they see them as weak, as immoral, as utterly failing in their obligations and duties as Muslims to protect the people that the Israelis are slaughtering. So I think in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, and I would add Egypt, the leadership in all of these states are very worried. And then you have, of course, Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, just went through an election and he didn't do well. And people are saying, oh, well, it's the economy. No, the economy in Turkey has been fragile for some time. He's up against a Turkish population that is enraged by what the Israelis are doing. And they are very frustrated with his failure to act. And to this must be added, obviously, the so-called Shiite crescent, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, as well as in Lebanon and also in Yemen. And they are sort of pop heroes at the moment because they've survived everything thrown at them and they continue to be effective. And then finally behind this stands Iran. And miraculously, I think Mr. Netanyahu looked at the situation and decided taking on Iran while he had not yet finished the job in Gaza was dangerous. And he didn't want a multi-front war at that point. So he's tried to narrow the focus to just Gaza, assuming if I can get that done, then I can turn my guns on Hezbollah and the Americans will have to help me. So we shall see. But that's a very dangerous set of circumstances. I know that the USS Eisenhower carrier battle group was on its way home and was turned around and is back in the Red Sea. So that tells me that we're standing by because we anticipate serious problems. I feel very sorry for the people sailing on that ship. I don't know when the last time was that they were at home, but I think that happens to a lot of people in the Navy these days. We're overstretched and undermanned. So we'll see what happens next, but none of it looks good anywhere. And everything is at a point now where it could blow up suddenly. And then a large part of our electorate in both Europe and the United States will say, well, what happened? How could this happen? Because they haven't paid attention and they have taken everyone at their word. And there's this very dangerous underlying assumption. War and its devastating consequences is something that happens on other people's soil. It doesn't come to America, it doesn't come to Norway, it doesn't even come to Poland. But they might be in for a tough education.
Yeah, again, I think this is often goes back to the past 30 years of bombing weaker countries because this is very different. And this has been my concern as well, because once NATO now bringing the war into Russia, obviously they have an incentive to restore their deterrent by bringing the war into NATO. And the idea that they would never do this is very strange to me because
Well,
the
I think it was Michael Howard who many years ago, and I've forgotten precisely where. I think it was in his volume, The Causes of War. He said that at some point in every crisis or conflict, there is a struggle between power and conscience. Well, we've had no conscience for a very long time, only power. And I think it's time for people to look inward, especially the leadership of their countries, and understand that their first and foremost duty is to ensure the survival of their state and its people. That's absolutely the top priority, not uh, pushing the Russians out of Ukraine, which is never going to happen, not trying to rescue the awful reputations of terrible people who are governing us. Those things are irrelevant. There has to be a conscience. Where is the conscience in Washington? Where is the conscience in London? And their power is not what it once was. So it is time to recognize the limitations of our power and resources, our ability to shape outcomes, and get on with life, not as a hegemon, but as members of a larger international community. But no one wants to do that right now. Everyone wants to posture as the hegemonic power. And that's what you see with Macron, and that's what you see in London, and that's what's happening here in Washington.
So, yeah, before we start to finish, I guess it's this amount of conflicts which are, yeah, just seem to be on a line. Because if we survive this standoff, nuclear standoff now with Russia, and we're also, yeah, able to prevent the Middle East from blowing up, there seems to also be preparation for war against China. Uh, I mean, do you see any? These are all nuclear power. Well, Iran being a threshold power, not an actual nuclear power yet. But do you see any signs that could fill us with optimism? Any way out of this? How?
I see one very strong possibility, and that's what we began with, and that is the potential for a very serious financial crisis and economic downturn that follows. We are on very thin ice financially, and you can listen to the usual suspects who've been telling us for years everything is fine, don't worry. But we know that almost 50% of our gross domestic product in the United States is government spending. How much of it is part of your GDP? These things are unsustainable. We have a 130% debt to GDP ratio. Well, that's if you look at the official numbers. If you begin to dig deeper, you find it's much worse. The Chinese, for instance, were approached by Yellen privately. And one of the things Yellen wanted to talk to them about was our treasuries, because our long-term treasuries, these are the 10 and 20-year treasuries that were sold years ago, are today worth nothing. And if those were to be sold very, very rapidly overnight, that would crash us. And if it crashed us, it would crash the rest of Europe and Japan. The Japanese have also got a large number of our treasuries. We are in a very bad position. Now, why haven't the Chinese done that? Because the Chinese, much like the Russians, are not interested in destroying us. That's what people don't get. They're not hell bent to destroy us. We, on the other hand, stupidly seem to be hell bent on destroying them, which is why this needs to end as quickly as possible. If you were to resurrect any number of presidents, I would say Harry Truman, Eisenhower, Teddy Roosevelt, Harding, Grover Cleveland. I mean, you go down the list, go all the way back to Grant, and told them that we're prepared to go to war over Taiwan, they would look at you as you've lost your mind. Said, what difference does it make who runs Taiwan? What do they make that we buy? Oh, well, microcircuitry. Well, can we still buy from them? you know, we were much more rational in those times, but we were much less powerful. We had a sense of limitation. There's none of that. So you have a very childish, immature ruling elite that has been drinking too much of its own Kool-Aid for too long. They're not going to last. I would prefer that they go away in something other than an imitation of Armageddon, or at least keep the Armageddon to the financial markets.
Yeah, but not only overstretching and weakening the financial markets and excessive debt and losing trust in the US dollar, but also then adding problem by actually weaponizing it the way not just all these excessive sanctions, but now even threatening the countries who are holding the debt to seize their reserves. I mean, they say it's a threat so far, but they already seized some of the profit of the assets, and of course the Chinese know if they take the Russian assets, they can take the Chinese. This seems very suicidal, something yeah, self-harm.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's almost as though I've got a grenade in my hand. I'm pulling the pin if you don't walk away from me. We destroy ourselves in the process. What a wonderful idea. No, it's utterly stupid. But again, these people are dug in. They populate your bureaucracies. It's not just the people that are elected to office, and they are all wrong-headed in their thinking. They've got to go away.
Uh, yeah. So yeah, before we turn off, I forgot one thing. This huge weapons package the Americans are sending now to Ukraine. Will this be enough to keep Ukraine afloat till the November elections, or how do you see this?
It's very doubtful because most of what's in that package will not arrive quickly. It'll be replacements for what's already been sent over. In some cases here, it's almost a shell game. The cash, of course, will be welcome because it can be stolen as usual in Ukraine. And I'm sure a lot of it will be stolen and end up in foreign banks to keep Mr. Zelensky and his friends in high cotton, as we say. But no, it's not going to make any difference to the battlefield at all. What is concerning right now is the arrival of these long-range strike systems. We're talking about ATACMS, for instance. Now, the good news for the Russians, I guess, is that they've been able to shoot them down, which was not the case when this war began. Again, the Russians have dramatically increased their capability and improved their performance thanks to this war. We have not. And that, I guess, is probably somewhat reassuring to the Russians. But the rest of these things, the Storm Shadow, Taurus missiles, and others, that's a more difficult proposition. And if enough of those are launched deep into Russian territory and kill Russian citizens, destroy Russian infrastructure, the more likely that the things you've heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov and Dmitry Medvedev will happen.
Well, yeah, let's hope cooler minds prevail, I guess. Colonel, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you as well, Glenn. Bye-bye.